Two wildcard strikers are in focus on today's episode of NUFC Transfer Daily, as well as a former Premier League midfielder that I think Newcastle should really consider signing before the end of the window. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please do hit the subscribe button and the like button on the video. If you haven't already, do join the community. I'm really looking forward to getting into the start of the season. It's only a week to go. I'm not at the Seller Cup either tonight against Espanyol or tomorrow against Atletico Madrid, but I'm hoping to be at maybe Villa, but certainly Liverpool. This season is going to be huge for the channel, so please do get involved. As I said, today we're going to be looking at a midfielder and two strikers. One striker that I wasn't actually going to discuss at all, but I saw something on Good Morning Transfers on Sky Sports News this morning that I thought worth a question. Let's just put it that way. It's not a suggestion of what I want to do. Again, same as the video yesterday, a couple of people in the comment section thought that I was making a case for players that I really wasn't. I was just sort of talking about the reality of the situation with Alexander Isak's replacement. If Newcastle are going to do that, I still think Newcastle should keep Isak. He isn't going to be playing this weekend. That was announced yesterday, but that's not really a surprise given that he's not been training. He's still not back in with the team. I think Eddie Howe would want him back with the team next week. That's just my thought. I think it's not a case of just banishing him until he leaves. I think Newcastle are accepting that he does probably have to go if they can get replacements, and they are looking for replacements. Obviously, the Sesko situation, now that looks like it is sorted. I mean, yesterday the news came through that he'd agreed with Manchester United, Manchester United agreed with Leipzig, and he has flown into Manchester, so that is pretty much done without it being officially announced. Newcastle now have to get back to the drawing board, and the reality of the Isak situation, if you're going to replace him, is, like I said yesterday, the perfect scenario of finding the next best thing. Sesko is kind of the last one. Maybe Samu, but I think he's a little bit behind as well. He talks about other players like Ollie Watkins who can come in and do a job for a couple of years, but not a long-term fix. Dusan Vlahovic, big risk to turn his career around. But we are going to be talking about a couple more names a little bit later. But as you know on the channel, I've been speaking about the midfield quite a lot and quite frustrated about the lack of noise around the midfield, and the fact that they've sold Sean Longstaff, and yes, they need a replacement, but they are not looking to upgrade the midfield. It's not as important as other positions. The strikers have really taken over this window, when actually I think most people thought, second striker to replace Wilson would have come in, but right midfield would have been the big thing, centre-back would have been the big thing, goalkeeper would have been the big thing, and goalkeeper's been sorted by a loan signing with Premier League experience, and that's what I think they should do with the midfield if they are going to go big on the strikers, and that's where the majority of the budget's going to come in. They're obviously in talks with AC Milan over a potential deal for Malik Thiaw. There's an opportunity to strike in midfield, and that man is Douglas Luiz from Juventus, former Aston Villa player, 27 years old, Brazilian midfielder, can play as an 8, can play as a 6. Premier League experience, plug in and play as good as you're going to get in that scenario. £26 million apparently available for this summer. He moved, I think, to Juve for £40 million last summer as part of a sort of PSR situation. I think that's what forced Villa's hand into selling him. Newcastle, I think, would be a great option for him because he would get Champions League football. He'd play in a midfield with Joe Linton and Bruno, which he's done obviously 18 times. He's played for Brazil, so he's used to doing that. And it would be first team opportunities. Yes, obviously the midfield has got a lot of strength in Tonali, Bruno and Joe Linton, but behind that, as we've said, Willock is injured for 6 weeks and arguably not really good enough anymore. Miley is really the only other option. There needs to be another player in there who can do a job, and Douglas Luiz I think is really, really exciting as an option because he's a good age. He's still only 27. I've railed against this summer that 27 seems to be viewed as old. He seems to be viewed as the new 30 effectively because of the resale value. In a PSR world, everything has to be viewed as long-term investments and resale and all that sort of thing, but he would be a real opportunity to resurrect his career. And we've spoken about with strikers, we spoke, with Vlahovic yesterday and Gonzalo Ramos and other players. What direction do Newcastle go into with their signings between now and the end of the window? Because they've missed out on all of their top targets. That's been well documented. But do they but there's still plenty of good players out there, and still plenty of players who maybe don't have the cachet anymore of what they used to, but they still have a lot of quality. They need their careers getting back on track, and maybe that's where Newcastle can strike a few really interesting deals. Nottingham Forest and Everton are apparently interested in Douglas Luiz on loan. I think a loan deal with an obligation or an option to buy, similar to the Ramsdale deal, would be ideal, because he's got that Champions League experience. He's got that top level. Came through at Manchester City. Nobody's really doubted his quality, but he went to Juve and had some struggles. Got some stats here that really reflect what sort of midfielder he is. He's obviously somebody who can play as a 6, and that's what Newcastle have obviously previously thought that they lacked until Tonali came in, but he can be a good option deeper in the midfield, but he can also play as an 8. You look at the progressive carries, 85th percentile, successful take-ons, 95th percentile, 91st percentile for passes attempted as well. Shot creating actions, 93rd percentile, so he's getting forward a lot as well. But then I looked more deeply at his passing stats and more detailed passing stats. Completion 90%, attempted 91st percentile, passing distance 92nd percentile, long passes completed 94th percentile, long passes attempted 93rd percentile, 84th percentile for passes into the penalty area, key passes 91st percentile. So it's really good at sort of linking with the attackers. Defensively, dribbles tackled 98th percentile, 73rd percentile for tackles won, and defensive third tackles won 92nd percentile. So again, very versatile, very well-rounded possession. Really good stats here. Progressive carries 86th percentile, as I mentioned earlier. Passes received 90th percentile. Touches 90th percentile. Successful take-on percentage 96th percentile. Successful take-ons overall 95th percentile. Live ball touches 90th percentile. Really heavily involved in midfield. And this is at Juve last year, where he'd had a difficult campaign. We saw him at Villa being absolutely crucial to them getting into the Champions League. As I say, 27 years old, available for 26 million apparently this summer, but you could do a loan deal. I think Juve just really want him out of the club after a difficult season, and at this stage the reality is you're not going to find perfect players. The top targets are the ones who go first, and late in the window you're looking at players who other clubs have opted against. But you know, Alexander Isak was bought basically on deadline day 3 years ago. So I think this is where Newcastle need to be a little bit more creative. They've looked at people like Gonzalo Ramos. Douglas Luiz would be an ideal midfield option in my head for competition, but also readiness to play in the Premier League. Plug in and play, that's been the thing of this season, as I've railed against at times, but it makes a lot of sense with Douglas Luiz. It's a real point in his corner. He would make a massive difference to Everton, he would make a massive difference to Nottingham Forest, but he would also crucially make a massive difference to Newcastle. And Champions League football is what he would get at Newcastle. He could play with international teammates as well. That, I think, is a big sell to him. His attitude has been questioned a little bit, but I think risk and reward here, there's an element of risk with that, and the lack of performance last season is difficulties. But if you can get the right deal, get a loan deal with an obligation or an option or something like that, be creative. Somebody asked me a couple of weeks ago, or right at the start of summer actually, more closely, about why loan deals weren't as common. And it's not that they're not common, it's just that they become more common later in the window, because people are looking at permanent deals, people are looking at their main targets earlier on in the Junes and Julys. It's in August when these things become available, and players who need moves become more available, and it gets pushed a little bit more. And if you can get the right deal, I don't see any real downside to Douglas Luiz coming in. He's so good in that sort of progressive third, but also he's really good at the 6 as well. We've seen those stats there with his tackles in the defensive third of the pitch. He can be a midfield all-rounder that can take Newcastle to a new level. If they went into the season with Bruno Tonali, Joe Linton, Miley and Douglas Luiz, I think that would be something really exciting for Newcastle, because he, as I say, he's a plug-in and play player in the Premier League and also, crucially, the Champions League. Let me know what you think on that. Why haven't Newcastle been interested before? I think because they've had their focus elsewhere, and they will look at these players. A couple of other strikers, as I said, that we wanted to talk about, and one is Jorgen Strand Larsen from Wolves. He's been linked a couple of times in the last week. Craig Hope said yesterday that he's on the list and he's one to watch, and I think he would be a really ideal Callum Wilson replacement in terms of 14 goals last season for Wolves, 13 the season before for Celta Vigo in Spain as well. So he's got good pedigree. I think he's 25 years old, but he isn't an Isak replacement. I think Newcastle needs somebody with a little bit of a higher ceiling to replace Isak, either more experience, like someone like Watkins would be a better shout than Strand Larsen, or someone like Samu is probably, as I said yesterday, the last remaining player of that profile that they're looking for. Strand Larsen is really, really good player in terms of, and again though, look at his stats, very good in terms of in the box. He's not well rounded. If you look at his passes attempted, they're incredibly low stats. Progressive carries, pass completed, pass attempted, all sort of in the red lines. Assists is sort of barely green at 60%. Non-penalty goals is 75%. That's a team that really struggled last season, and that's a decent stat. But if you look more detailed at his shooting stats, they're not bad. The goals to shot ratio 97th percentile, shots on target percentage 99th percentile, XG 86th percentile, non-penalty goals XG 89th percentile. So I think the big thing with Strand Larsen is, again, like Blahovic, like a couple of players that we mentioned yesterday, he's a really, really talented player, but he's a goal scorer. He comes alive in the box. He's not somebody who's going to be well rounded. I think you want somebody who can dribble with the ball a bit better. I think you want somebody who can link the play a bit more, and that's something that I think needs to be considered when they're looking for a Isak replacement. I think Strand Larsen would be an excellent Wilson replacement. If he joined and Isak stayed, or if he joined and Watkins signed, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, or Samu, something like that, I think. But if he comes in as the Isak replacement, I think that is a little bit disappointing, because he's a great goal scorer. As I say, 14 goals last season for a struggling Wolves side, 13 in the season before for Celta Vigo. He's got good pedigree at sort of mid-table, lower top division sides. He deserves a chance at a higher level club, but it's a big risk to put that on the lack of roundedness in his game. As I said that about Vlahovic yesterday, I said that about a couple of others. I think that's not ideal. But let me know what you think about Strand Larsen. The other player, just quickly, Rasmus Hojlund for £40 million. I think it's a really interesting opportunity for somebody, potentially Newcastle. 40 million for Rasmus Hojlund because they've just signed Benjamin Sesko. I can hear you all in the comment section already saying no, because you don't want to give money to Manchester United and he's too much of a risk. But I really like Rasmus Hojlund. I always have. I liked him at Atalanta. Newcastle liked him at Atalanta as well. They watched him quite a bit, and he was heavily linked with a number of big clubs across Europe. And I was saying this about Nicholas Jackson yesterday. He's become a bit of a meme, Hojlund, really unfairly, I think. He scored 9 goals in his only full season at Atalanta, which was a decent return for the situation, but Manchester United were looking for their, effectively, Erling Haaland or Alexander Isak, their breakout star they could really build around, and they bid far too much. They bought him for about £80 million, £80 million, and then expect him to score goals as a 21-year-old immediately, and he buckled under the pressure over the last year. But actually in his first season he scored 10 goals in the Premier League and did actually really well, I thought, and looked like a really good player. There was a reason why Manchester United didn't buy a striker last summer, and it's because Hojlund had done so well. This year his confidence has fallen off. He needs to be fixed a little bit. He's only 23 years old still. Eddie Howe could work wonders with him. And again, going back to that theme of resurrecting careers, is that where Newcastle look now? Again, he's a big risk for an Isak replacement, but £40 million, if you can get him back on track, I certainly think there's a player in there. I always have I really liked him at Atalanta. Stern Grazzi did really well before then as well, so he's always had good pedigree at lower levels. He was thrust into a bear pit at Old Trafford at a difficult time, and then he hasn't really been given the support he needs. Could Eddie Howe resurrect his career? I don't think this will happen at all, but let me know in the comment section. I finally have the bravery to actually say this, because I've thought this for a long time, but I didn't want to get too much stick, because I know what people said about Nicholas Jackson. Hojlund's a really, really talented player, I think. I liked him at Atalanta. Newcastle liked him at Atalanta. This could be something that would work if at the right price. 40 million has been set. Let me know in the comment section if you think that's worth it. Again, context is key. Would he be worth it alongside someone like Watkins? Would he be worth it alongside someone like maybe Samu as a second striker, as a Wilson replacement, and work with him to get the best out of him down the line? I think it's a little bit risky to put him in the firing line as an Isak replacement directly, similar to Strand Larsen. But let me know what you think on the 2 new strikers, but crucially more about Douglas Luiz. I think that is a really good fit, given the context, because Newcastle are having to adapt and react to the disappointments in the transfer market. I think really that's a video for another day in terms of what's gone wrong this summer. But given the situation, given the context of where they are, Douglas Luiz would be an ideal signing. If it's a loan deal especially, and there's no obligation to buy, it does save money on PSR in years to come if they don't end up buying him. And I do accept that a hefty loan fee would still come out like the first part of a transfer fee. That is good context for PSR. But yeah, Douglas Luiz, let me know what you think in the comment section. I think that would fit perfectly, allow Newcastle to go and spend a little bit more on other positions as well. Thanks so much for joining me this week on NUFC Transfer Daily. I'll be back on Monday to react to more transfer stuff, also the Seller Cup as well, and look forward to the Premier League season. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you then. Cheers.